It started with a footprint, not a metaphorical one, but a real impression pressed into stone, shaped like a human foot, yet preserved in rock that science says predates us by millions of years. In 1938, along the banks of the Paluxy River in Texas, a drought revealed secrets long buried. Shallow water peeled back the earth, exposing limestone bedrock patterned with dinosaur tracks. And beside them, something else. Clear human footprints, anatomically precise, with arches and heel strikes, preserved in the same layer as the three-toed giants of the Cretaceous period. Dr. Roland Bird, a paleontologist working for the American Museum of Natural History, arrived with the task of explaining them away. Locals had tipped off the museum, describing giant man tracks beside dinosaur prints. The assumption was that Bird would debunk a local hoax. Instead, he found something that would haunt the rest of his career. Bird didn't just find a few prints, he documented over 100. Footprints ranging from 12 to 21 inches in length, some walking, others running, some placed cautiously as if avoiding nearby reptilian impressions. The stone bore weight impressions consistent with real human stride mechanics. The layers of rock matched the dinosaur tracks perfectly. Same age, same depth, same sedimentary signature. And that's where the story diverged, not in the rock, but in the halls of academia. Bird's findings were too impossible. The existence of human footprints alongside dinosaur tracks challenged the very bedrock of evolutionary timelines. So rather than revising theories, institutions revised the narrative. The museum declined to accept the slabs Bird attempted to preserve. His written accounts faded into academic silence. When others came forward in support, scientists from Berkeley and independent geologists, they were quietly removed from their posts or stripped of funding. The riverbed was eventually vandalized, tracks chiseled away, evidence lost. Plaster casts, once preserved in museum collections, mysteriously disappeared. Tourists still visit the area, guided along paths that avoid the controversial prints. Meanwhile, research grants for further investigation dry up before proposals are even read. What if the past isn't just misremembered, but deliberately unacknowledged? This is not just about one footprint. It's about the boundaries of belief, the line where science meets story and inconvenient data becomes dangerous. Bird didn't find proof that rewrites all of history. He found something that asks too many questions at once. As you listen to what follows, consider this. If one footprint can be buried so easily, what else have we paved over in the name of certainty? This is a journey through forgotten evidence, sealed archives, and whispered truths. It's not a call to conspiracy, but an invitation to curiosity. Because the deeper we dig, not into the earth, but into our understanding of time, the more we must admit how little we truly know, and how much has been left behind in stone. The sea has always hidden secrets beneath its surface, but some maps speak louder than silence. Between 1955 and 1968, Columbia University's Marine Geology program set out to chart the Mediterranean seafloor. Their goal was scientific: gather sonar data to study tectonics, sediment, and ancient coastlines. But what they found stretched far beyond geology. Sonar scans returned impossible patterns: rectilinear grids, intersecting avenues, vast squares. These weren't random geological features. They were organized layouts, complete with right angles, long corridors, and what appeared to be building foundations. At first, the scientists assumed equipment malfunction. Then, as they moved through multiple Mediterranean basins, the patterns repeated, identical in scale and spacing, echoing city designs. Leading the expedition was Dr. Bruce Heen, a marine geologist with no reason to invite controversy. Heen's team began to piece together what looked like submerged metropolises, complete with plazas, street networks, even harbors with artificial breakwaters. The features lay hundreds of feet beneath the surface, at depths consistent with sea levels during the last ice age. This meant one thing: if these structures were real, they were built over 12,000 years ago, long before the birth of agriculture, writing, or cities, according to accepted timelines. The implications were seismic. Not just a city underwater, but a civilization that predated Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. A culture that engineered large-scale urban centers when humanity was supposedly still nomadic. And yet, no papers followed, no lectures, no museum exhibits. Heian's attempts to publish were met with quiet refusals. Peer reviewers dismissed the sonar results as natural formations. Funding was pulled. Access to raw sonar data was restricted. Columbia quietly stepped away from the project. Behind closed doors, the findings were reclassified as geological anomalies. The National Science Foundation, which had funded the mapping effort, terminated further exploration. The data was sealed. Years later, when independent researchers requested access, they were told the records no longer existed. And just like that, the underwater cities were forgotten. Except they weren't. Some sonar images leaked. A few members of the original team shared what they'd seen. Quietly, a network of independent marine archaeologists formed, but faced the same barriers: denied permits, revoked grants, institutional silence. Survey ships mysteriously avoided key coordinates. The Mediterranean, once thought to be an open book, was now redacted. Still, the echoes remain. Clean lines beneath the sea, angles too perfect to be nature's own. Geometry that speaks of human hands working long before history began to take notes. What if the myth of Atlantis isn't just myth, but a memory, distorted by time, buried beneath water, and smoothed by centuries of sediment? What if we've mistaken flood myths for fantasy when they may have been desperate records of something very real? The sea does not forget. It only waits. Beneath a continent of ice lies a contradiction, a fossilized whisper from a time when Antarctica bloomed with life. In 1980, a multinational scientific team ventured to the bottom of the world. Their mission: to drill deep into Antarctica's ice sheets and uncover climate history written layer by layer, snowfall by snowfall, going back hundreds of thousands of years. Leading the Soviet contingent was Dr. Elena Petrov, a respected climatologist. Her team operated from a remote station using advanced core drilling equipment. As they reached depths corresponding to roughly 400,000 years ago, something astonishing surfaced. Tropical plants, preserved in exquisite detail, ferns, palm fronds, even delicate flowering species, organic remnants that shouldn't exist in a place supposedly frozen for millions of years. The find was not the result of contamination. Petrov's lab confirmed this through cross-sample analysis and carbon dating. These plants belonged to the layer they were found in. They had grown in Antarctica, at a time when the continent should have been gripped by ice. But it didn't stop there. Pollen studies showed complete ecosystems: plants, insects, even warm-water marine organisms. Biological markers painted a portrait of a thriving temperate world, not a frozen wasteland. The implications were enormous. Antarctica, the coldest place on Earth, had once been lush. This didn't merely challenge climate models, it rewrote the planet's memory. Sediment layers revealed ancient volcanoes once active beneath open skies. Soil samples suggested rich earth, not sterile ice. For a moment, Petrov glimpsed a forgotten world, one where continents breathed differently and warmth visited even the poles. But that moment passed. As news of the findings reached international partners, pressure mounted. The data was flagged as sensitive. Research materials were classified. The fossils disappeared into restricted archives. When NASA's team, who had been collaborating on the drill project, prepared their own climate reports, they were told to exclude Petrov's fossils. Officially, no such evidence existed. Presentations were altered. Conferences removed references. The site itself was later deemed environmentally sensitive, closed to all future drilling. Today, most of what we know about Antarctic climate history comes from cores drilled elsewhere, places carefully chosen not to raise uncomfortable questions. But the core samples Petrov's team retrieved told a different story. A story of radical planetary change, of warm forests beneath southern stars. A story that suggests Earth's climate and its memory is far more fluid than we believe. So what if polar ice is not a permanent fixture but a passing phase? What if the real history of our world includes cycles of flourishing life in places we've only known as barren? And what if the patterns we're trying to model today are missing entire chapters, chapters sealed under centuries of denial and frost? Sometimes the coldest places on Earth hold the warmest secrets. And sometimes the past is not what we froze into textbooks, but what we chose not to thaw. The ocean doesn't care for borders. It carries whispers across continents, currents laced with memory. In 1969 and again in 1970, explorer Thor Heyerdahl set out not just to sail across the seas, but to challenge history itself. Heyerdahl believed ancient peoples possessed maritime skills far beyond what textbooks allowed. His expeditions, the Ra and Ra-2, were meant to prove that early civilizations could cross vast oceans using primitive boats and ancient knowledge. Constructed from reeds using ancient Egyptian techniques, his vessels weren't built for comfort, but for truth. And they worked. The Ra-2 crossed the Atlantic. But what Heyerdahl's team encountered along the way raised questions even deeper than their keel. They found signs, not just of possibility, but of precedent. On remote Atlantic islands, they discovered artificial markers, stone structures aligned to stars, carved signal platforms visible from the sea, and harbors not shaped by nature, but by deliberate design. Radiocarbon testing placed these installations thousands of years old. They hadn't drifted into place. They were engineered, positioned, and maintained by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Even more startling, marine biologists aboard Ra-2 collected barnacles and sea life from the hull. When studied, these organisms showed genetic mixtures that shouldn't have existed together unless maritime contact had been routine over millennia. Ancient ships, it seemed, had carried more than just cargo. They had transported ecosystems. The implications were vast. If correct, it meant the ancient world wasn't isolated into silos of civilization, but interconnected by global networks of trade, travel, and shared knowledge. But institutions weren't ready for that map. When Heyerdahl presented his findings, the reaction was swift and dismissive. Universities labeled the artifacts natural formations. Maritime archaeology organizations declined to investigate the sites, citing cultural sensitivity. Requests to revisit the navigational markers were blocked by newly instated environmental treaties. Even satellite surveys began avoiding those coordinates. The data Heyerdahl's team gathered, charts, logs, biological samples, was quietly sidelined. The Ra-2 was celebrated for its bravery, but not for its discoveries. And so the image of the ancient mariner remained unchanged in our textbooks. Provincial, coastal, limited. Yet the evidence pointed elsewhere. Stone beacons aligned to the stars. Reefs reshaped into harbors. Genetic signatures of 1,000 crossings. What if the ancients knew the sea not as a barrier, but as a bridge? What if culture didn't spread from a single cradle, but blossomed at once, in many places, connected by tide and sail? And what if the maps we study are missing more than ink and paper? What if they're missing the entire story of how we once knew the world? The sea leaves no borders behind, but it does leave traces if we care to follow. They went looking for cave art. What they found was an entire city buried beneath sand and time. Between 1975 and 1982, a joint French-Algerian archaeological team led by Henri Lot ventured into the Sahara Desert to study Neolithic rock carvings. What began as a routine survey took a turn when ground-penetrating radar returned impossible readings. Sharp corners, underground chambers, extensive walls, running in geometric patterns beneath dunes that had stood undisturbed for centuries. Excavation revealed stone cities. Not villages, not camps. Cities complete with multi-story buildings, paved streets, sewage systems, and courtyards large enough to host gatherings of thousands. The structures were aligned with astronomical precision, their walls built to withstand earthquakes and extremes of desert heat. Carbon dating placed the ruins around 8,000 BCE, long before the rise of dynastic Egypt, long before the Sahara became desert. In that distant epoch, this region was green. Rivers flowed, grasslands spread for miles, and the sky rained with seasonal rhythm. The people who lived there were not primitive nomads. They were urban planners, engineers, astronomers. Their cities included aqueducts, cisterns, and climate-adaptive architecture. Agricultural remains showed crop rotation, soil enhancement, and irrigation techniques more advanced than what's credited to many later civilizations. But the most astonishing finds were metallurgical artifacts, tools, ornaments, and alloys crafted using high-temperature techniques. The analysis showed knowledge of chemical composition and temperature control, indicating not trial and error, but expertise. And yet, when Lott's team attempted to publish their findings, the doors began to close. Egyptian archaeological authorities resisted any claim that might shift the origin of African civilization away from the Nile. French institutions, wary of the implications for colonial history, suppressed the reports. Access to the sites was restricted. Permits were revoked. Satellite imagery eventually confirmed what Lott had claimed. Beneath the sands lay patterns no wind could form. But on the ground, digging was no longer permitted. The buried cities were quietly declared protected heritage zones, safe from damage, but also from inquiry. The official story remained. The Sahara has always been a barrier, not a birthplace. But these ruins tell another story. One of lost complexity. Of a civilization that rose before the known ones and fell before they began. What if the ancestors of Egypt didn't start at the Nile, but remembered it from somewhere else? What if deserts are not always wastelands, but graveyards of forgotten brilliance? And what if the sand doesn't hide the truth? It protects it, waiting for us to look again. The Sahara was not always silent. Once it echoed with voices, footsteps, and stone striking stone in the rhythm of a world we've chosen to forget. In the Arctic silence, deep beneath frozen soil, they found stories older than history. The year was 1973. A team of international researchers, led by Dr. James Mitchell, was drilling into the permafrost of the far north. Their mission, to gather climate data. What they unearthed instead were tools, crafted, sharpened, deliberate. Objects not shaped by nature but by hands, and those hands had lived here 45,000 years ago. The layers of ice and soil told the tale. Sophisticated flint tools, composite hunting gear, fragments of woven fabric, and artistic carvings, all frozen in a time capsule predating the accepted arrival of humans in the Americas by tens of thousands of years. The precision of the tools was stunning. Evidence of standardized designs, multi-material construction, and adhesives that required advanced chemical knowledge. Even more remarkable were preserved components of boats, including stitched hides, flexible hulls, and what appeared to be rudimentary sail systems. This wasn't just survival. It was engineering. Carbon dating confirmed it. These weren't misplaced objects or anomalies. The humans who made them had lived through Ice Age conditions, adapting to polar climates with technology and strategy once thought impossible for the time. The implications shattered the timeline. If people were in the Arctic 45,000 years ago, navigating coasts, hunting in organized groups, crafting tools with precision, It meant that human migration to the Americas didn't begin via a land bridge 15,000 years ago. It had begun far earlier, and by routes we had not imagined. But the discovery didn't rewrite textbooks. Instead, it was quietly removed from them. Mitchell's findings, once prepared for peer-reviewed publication, were halted. Funding vanished. Access to dig sites was revoked. The artifact collections were classified. When questioned, institutions cited environmental protection. The story ended, not in print, but in silence. University departments stopped discussing pre-Clovis migration. Anthropological journals rejected follow-up studies. Independent researchers who pursued similar lines of inquiry found their projects blocked by administrative roadblocks and international treaty restrictions. The Arctic, once open to exploration, became cordoned off, sealed by bureaucratic frost. But the tools remain. Somewhere beneath the permafrost lie the echoes of people who defied ice with ingenuity. They mapped the stars, built vessels, and crossed oceans when we still believed they hunted in packs with sticks. What if human history isn't a slow ascent, but a series of forgotten peaks? What if the first Americans didn't walk across land, but sailed the edges of the world? And what if the ice remembers what we refuse to believe? The past is not always behind us. Sometimes it's beneath our feet, waiting patiently in the cold. The tunnels weren't supposed to exist. In 1987, during the expansion of London's Jubilee Underground Line, engineers encountered something that brought the construction project to a standstill. Not utility lines or Roman ruins, but tunnels. Ancient ones, smooth, geometrically perfect, stretching in patterns no one expected. Dr. Margaret Foster, the lead archaeologist on site, was prepared to find remnants of London's layered history. Roman foundations, medieval cellars, Victorian infrastructure. But what her team uncovered lay far below those familiar timelines. Structures carved with engineering precision, predating Roman London by millennia. The subterranean system included circular tunnels, expertly reinforced and ventilated. The air within them moved, as if the designers understood pressure gradients and airflow. Chambers branched off with regularity, some connecting to natural underground rivers and caverns, an ancient fusion of the man-made and the geological. Yet, the architecture demonstrated not just survival, but mastery. The materials used, stone, metal reinforcements, mineral-based mortars, showed knowledge of load distribution and environmental control. Tool marks bore evidence of methods more precise than chisels or primitive picks. Some of the tunnel walls had curves so exact they matched tolerances in modern tunneling operations. And then came the foundations. Pillared platforms, drainage channels, and even early flood controls, designed with intention, with understanding. Foster's team submitted their findings for analysis, and that's when the silence began. Instead of curiosity, they faced red tape. London's historical institutions downplayed the discovery. The city's transport authority classified the sites, citing preservation. Construction was rerouted to avoid the ancient structures. Archaeological access was revoked. Foster's report, drafted with care and evidence, was never published. Her career quietly stalled. Publicly, the tunnels were dismissed as natural formations modified by later activity. Yet none could explain the scale, the coherence, the precision engineering buried below one of the world's oldest cities. There was no record of any civilization in pre-Roman Britain capable of such construction. No documentation, no myths, just stone, shadow, and silence. But the underground world remained. Modern development avoids these zones. Survey teams are instructed not to probe too deeply in certain areas. Heritage laws protect but also prevent. What lies beneath London is preserved, but only for those with clearance. What if the story of Britain's origin starts not in conquest or empire, but far beneath its streets? What if civilizations rose and fell long before parchment, before plow, before coin? And what if we've built our future on the ceilings of their forgotten rooms? London keeps many secrets. Some are in its archives, others are in its ground. They called it the lungs of the earth. But deep in the Amazon, satellites captured something else, an ancient heartbeat. In 1999, Dr. Anna Clark led a multinational team tasked with tracking deforestation in Brazil. Using the latest satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, their goal was ecological: measure human impact, model change. But as the scans came in, strange shapes began to appear: grids, circles, and straight lines stretching across miles of dense jungle. These weren't logging roads or modern clearings. They were far older, etched into the landscape, overgrown but unmistakable. What Clark's team had stumbled upon were the remains of cities. Vast urban networks, earthworks forming streets, canals, walls, and ceremonial structures. Some were arranged in geometric alignments resembling constellations. Others showed complex road systems that linked multiple urban hubs across hundreds of miles. When the team followed up with field expeditions, they confirmed the patterns weren't natural. Beneath layers of soil and roots lay engineered mounds, buried foundations, and remnants of architecture shaped for administration, ceremony, and residence. These were not isolated settlements. They were parts of a civilization that, according to accepted history, shouldn't have existed. Archaeologists had long believed the Amazon's poor soil couldn't support large populations, that the indigenous groups there lived in small, scattered tribes. But the satellite evidence said otherwise. This forest had once been carefully sculpted, managed, not just inhabited. The people who lived here had transformed the land without destroying it. They developed raised field agriculture, aquaculture systems, and soil enhancement techniques so advanced that remnants of their terra preta, or dark earth, still support lush growth today. These were not crude methods, they were sustainable science. Population models, drawn from the scale of the urban complexes, suggested millions once lived in these rainforests. Not just surviving, but thriving. And then the suppression began. As news spread, environmental agencies raised concerns. The story shifted. Promoting ancient large-scale Amazonian civilizations, some argued, might weaken efforts to protect the forest. The data was classified by Brazilian authorities. Access to the radar archives was blocked. Expeditions were curtailed, rerouted, or denied. Academic institutions distanced themselves. Research grants vanished. Indigenous protection laws, rightful and necessary, were repurposed to prohibit exploration in areas that might confirm pre-Columbian urbanization. The narrative was preserved. The Amazon was virgin, untouched, and had always been. But beneath the canopy, the earth tells another story, a story of planners, builders, astronomers, and engineers who understood how to live with nature, not against it. What if the key to our future was rooted in their past? What if sustainability wasn't invented but remembered? And what if the jungle isn't hiding ruins, but knowledge, waiting for us to see it not as wilderness, but as a forgotten world? The Amazon still breathes, but listen closely, and you might hear the voices that once shaped it. The North Sea is a quiet place, wind, waves, and the slow churn of oil rigs. But in the 1980s, that silence was broken by something ancient. During offshore drilling operations, engineers began retrieving core samples laced with something unexpected: evidence of human presence, worked stone, carved wood, metal fragments embedded in layers of sediment that predated the post-glacial floods. Dr. Robert Hansen, a marine geologist consulting for the oil companies, noticed a pattern. These weren't isolated anomalies. Across multiple sites, hundreds of feet below the surface, there were signs of construction: stone foundations, breakwaters, harbor-like formations, structures that once stood above sea level. The implications were staggering. The North Sea, now a cold and restless expanse of water, had once been home to sprawling settlements. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that these artifacts belong to a time when the seabed was dry land, 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. That meant advanced civilizations existed in northern Europe during the last ice age, far earlier than official history allowed. Hansen's research uncovered signs of metallurgy, complex tool-making, and even artistic expression. The metal artifacts showed evidence of alloy production and casting techniques far ahead of their presumed time. The settlements were not just temporary camps. They were organized, permanent, and technologically capable. But as word of the discoveries spread, the response was cold. Oil companies, fearing delays due to archaeological protections, declined to report further findings. Government agencies classified the sites. Maritime archaeology institutions labeled the evidence as natural formations or dismissed it outright. Access was restricted. The North Sea had become not just a drilling ground, but a boundary between what was found and what could be spoken. Hansen's attempts to publish were met with polite rejections. Universities were unwilling to fund follow-up expeditions. Heritage organizations declined involvement. Charts were redrawn, survey routes redirected. The ancient cities of the North Sea were edited out of the record. Today, few know that beneath those waves lie the outlines of homes, roads, and stonework, touched by hands older than any known European empire. What if the cradle of civilization wasn't just in the Fertile Crescent, but also in the lands now lost to rising tides? What if history isn't just written in stone, but submerged in silence? And what if the stories we've lost to water are the very ones that connect us to each other, to the earth, and to a past more complex than we've dared to imagine? The North Sea remains calm, but beneath its surface, time is waiting. In the heart of Australia's red deserts, time runs deep, but it was a new way of seeing time that changed everything. Between 1985 and 1990, Dr. Rhys Jones and his team introduced advanced thermoluminescence dating techniques to ancient Aboriginal sites across the continent. They expected to confirm the conventional timeline, human habitation in Australia around 40,000 years ago. Instead, the results came back older, much older. The data showed evidence of complex human presence dating back 60,000 to 80,000 years. And it wasn't just presence. The artifacts unearthed included finely made tools, ceremonial art, and the remains of dwellings and fire pits arranged in ways that suggested planning and tradition. There were pigments still embedded in cave walls, ochre quarries used for symbolic decoration, and stone arrangements aligned with celestial events. These weren't relics of survival, they were expressions of culture. The implications were immediate and profound. If Aboriginal civilizations had existed that long and with such complexity, it meant they had developed independently of the migration waves traditionally credited with spreading human innovation. It challenged the idea that sophistication only flowed from the ancient Near East, Asia, or Europe. Jones's team also studied ancient trade routes, language structures, and ecological management practices passed down through oral history. They found signs of sophisticated knowledge systems, navigation by stars, seasonal land use, and resource renewal strategies that mirrored sustainability models only now being embraced by modern science. Australia's first peoples hadn't just adapted to the land, they had shaped it, lived in harmony with it, and passed down that wisdom for tens of thousands of years. But the pushback was swift. Anthropological institutions resisted the extended timeline. To accept it would require rewriting global migration theories and re-examining the supposed primitive label long imposed on Aboriginal cultures. Funding for Jones's research dwindled. Access to key sites was restricted. Government agencies quietly shelved the findings, citing political and cultural sensitivities. Some argued that acknowledging a far older Aboriginal presence might complicate land rights cases. Others feared it would challenge the foundational myths of colonization and national identity. But the land tells its own story, And the dating doesn't lie. What if the oldest living culture in the world holds knowledge not just of survival, but of time, space, and place passed down across 3,000 generations? What if science is only now catching up to stories that have been sung for 80,000 years? And what if the most advanced form of civilization isn't always measured in metal or stone, but in memory, stewardship, and balance? In Australia's deserts, the past is not lost. It is living, if only we choose to listen. Some say the earth keeps no secrets, but in the layers of stone along a quiet Texas riverbank, something extraordinary was whispered and quickly buried. The Paluxy River near Glen Rose, Texas, has long been known for its dinosaur tracks. Preserved in ancient limestone, these three-toed imprints march across the riverbed, fossilized remnants of a time when massive reptiles ruled the land. But alongside them, too precisely placed to ignore, were other tracks, human ones. Discovered in the 1930s and examined in detail by Dr. Roland Bird in 1938, these prints were anatomically correct: arches, toe separations, heel imprints. Dozens of them, preserved in the same layer of rock as the dinosaur tracks. Bird, a paleontologist from the American Museum of Natural History, initially believed he would debunk the stories. Instead, he found a mystery too large for science to hold. These weren't random indentations. Some of the human-like tracks showed changes in direction, gait, even evidence of movement to avoid the dinosaur paths. The geology was consistent. The compression of the prints indicated genuine, weight-bearing movement. And yet the timeline didn't allow it. Humans and dinosaurs were never supposed to have met. Bird documented everything. He made casts. He wrote reports. But the museum refused to support his conclusions. The evidence contradicted core principles of evolutionary chronology. The official position became one of denial. Later, other scientists corroborated Bird's findings, but faced professional exile. Dr. Cecil Dougherty of UC Berkeley lost tenure after publishing a paper supporting the authenticity of the prints. Over time, many of the tracks were vandalized. Plaster casts mysteriously disappeared from archives. The clearest footprints are now gone. And so the Paluxy tracks faded, not from the stone, but from memory. Today, tourists can still visit the site. Guides point to the dinosaur prints with pride. But the human-like tracks are seldom mentioned, even though photographs and eyewitness accounts persist. What if the true conflict isn't between science and superstition, but between curiosity and control? What if discovery doesn't always lead to insight, but to censorship? And what if our past is far less linear than we've been told, folding over itself like footprints pressed side by side in ancient mud, now turned to stone? The river flows on, indifferent, but the rocks remember. At the bottom of the world, where wind carves ice and silence reigns, the past whispered from the depths, and was quickly silenced. In 1980, a multinational team drilled deep into the Antarctic ice to study Earth's climatic past. Led by Soviet climatologist Dr. Elena Petrov, they sought to extract cores that could reveal hundreds of thousands of years of atmospheric history. What they found was green. At depths corresponding to 400,000 years ago, the team discovered plant fossils, perfectly preserved ferns, palm fronds, and flowering species. Their cell structures were intact. The samples were embedded in ice that matched every stratigraphic and radiometric expectation. There was no contamination, no anomaly. Antarctica, during this distant epoch, had once bloomed. Pollen analysis confirmed a temperate ecosystem, soil microbes, insects, even marine organisms that thrived in warm oceans. It wasn't a brief anomaly, but an entire biosphere. This evidence challenged everything. If Antarctica had supported tropical life in the midst of a supposed glacial age, then global climate models were missing entire chapters. Ice ages may not have been as global or as static as once thought. The Earth's climate had flipped, radically, suddenly, and without warning. Petrov's team prepared to publish. Their research had the potential to revolutionize climate science. But instead of acclaim, they were met with silence. Then, obstruction. International climate organizations suppressed the findings. The Soviet Academy of Sciences classified the fossils. NASA collaborators were instructed to omit any references to tropical plant material from their official reports. Petrov's name was removed from research credits. The drilling site was declared off-limits under environmental regulations, never to be revisited. The ice cores remain locked away in undisclosed facilities. No independent verification allowed. Meanwhile, mainstream climate reconstructions exclude the fossil evidence, presenting a smoothed, linear version of Earth's past, devoid of abrupt changes, of contradictions, of wonder. What if climate isn't just a product of carbon and chemistry, but of forces we haven't yet grasped? What if the poles, long thought lifeless, were once the cradles of forgotten worlds? And what if our fear of rewriting what we know outweighs our desire to know what really was? The ice doesn't lie, but it can be hidden, and under the pressure of time and silence, even the greenest memories can be buried in white. The idea was simple: map the Mediterranean seabed. What followed was anything but. Between 1955 and 1968, Columbia University's Marine Geology program conducted extensive sonar surveys across the Mediterranean. Funded to study underwater tectonics and continental shifts, the team expected geological formations, maybe remnants of old coastlines. Instead, they found cities. Under hundreds of feet of water, sonar scans revealed structured grids, networks of straight lines, geometric enclosures, and right angles too precise for nature alone. These weren't vague shapes. They formed clear layouts, avenues, plazas, harbor walls, and defensive rings, structures that looked planned, lived in, lost. The data suggested these submerged sites predated known civilizations by at least 10,000 years, aligning with sea levels from the last ice age. If true, it meant advanced human societies had built monumental structures long before Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Greece. A forgotten chapter of civilization lay beneath the waves. Dr. Bruce Heen, who led much of the research, tried to present the findings, but institutional resistance came quickly. Archaeological authorities denied the possibility of pre-agricultural urbanism. The National Science Foundation ended support. Columbia archived the data but refused access. Even more telling, new expeditions were quietly discouraged. Independent researchers found their permits blocked. Areas of interest were labeled as protected or restricted. Some sonar maps were quietly reclassified as natural formations. Others vanished. The underwater cities were not disproven. They were simply ignored. Today, sonar still maps the Mediterranean, but key coordinates remain blank on public charts. The structures are still there. The silence surrounding them is the only thing that's changed. What if the rise of civilization wasn't linear, but cyclical? What if sea level rise didn't just threaten our future, but already erased our past? And what if the origins we seek aren't buried in deserts, but drowned in forgotten seas? The ocean hides its ruins well, but even water cannot wash away truth. We have always looked backward to understand who we are. But what happens when the past we uncover no longer fits the story we've told ourselves? 10 scientific expeditions, 10 discoveries that challenged the core timelines of human history. From footprints in stone beside dinosaurs to urban networks beneath the Amazon canopy. From cities drowned beneath seas to civilizations erased by sand and ice. Each finding offered a glimpse, not into myth, but into a reality more complex, more ancient, and more advanced than anything our textbooks contain. In every case, the pattern repeated: discovery, resistance, silence. Researchers were discredited, data classified, evidence destroyed or sequestered, not because the findings were fraudulent, but because they were inconvenient. Because they threatened the scaffolding of belief that underlies institutional authority. The suppression wasn't orchestrated by shadowy figures in smoke-filled rooms. It was systemic, a reflex born from fear of chaos, of rewriting everything, of losing control over the narrative. Science, meant to be a method of discovery, became a gatekeeper of orthodoxy. And yet, these discoveries did happen. Human footprints beside dinosaur tracks, urban ruins beneath Saharan dunes, sophisticated tools in Arctic ice, plant fossils in Antarctic cores, stone tunnels beneath London, cities beneath waves, trade across oceans long before Columbus. All of them remain, scattered across sealed archives, old photographs, satellite data, and the living memory of researchers whose voices were muted. So what do we do with this? We listen, not to claim certainty, but to ask better questions, not to dismantle science, but to restore its humility, to remember that discovery often begins where certainty ends. The truth may be that our ancestors were not simpler versions of us, but different, not bound to our trajectory, but charting their own. They mastered landscapes in ways we've forgotten. They understood time, space, and sustainability through experience, not textbooks. Their voices echo through the ruins, in the architecture aligned to stars, in the art carved on cave walls, in the roads swallowed by jungle and sea. They are not gone. They are waiting. What if history is not a straight line, but a spiral? What if we've fallen, risen, forgotten, and remembered again and again? And what if the greatest discovery still ahead of us is how much we've already lost? This journey is not about proving one story over another. It is about reclaiming the right to ask, to wonder, to dig beyond what we are told is possible. Because in the end, history does not belong to the victors. It belongs to the earth, and the earth remembers everything.